Welcome to the Honest Designers Show, your transparent look into life as a modern designer. My name's Tom Ross and I'm the founder at designcuts.com, and this week I'm joined by my fellow Brit and hand lettering expert Ian Barnard, American retro design expert Big D Lee, and the incredibly talented South African illustrator Lisa Glantz. This week we're talking with the one and only Andy J. Pizza. Andy is a prolific illustrator who's worked with some of the most respected brands in the world. All four of us love his particular style of illustration, and we're also huge fans of the Creative Pep Talk podcast that Andy releases regularly, giving back insane value to the design community. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Andy.
Hello!
Yay,
Welcome. Happy to be here.
We were saying just before we jumped on, this is overdue, I feel like. I'm glad it's finally happening.
Me too. I've heard a ton of great things about your show. I know that you have been in the business of kind of demystifying the design world and bringing it down and humbling it a little bit, making it a little more approachable, kind of giving it taking off the glasses of the person and then making them all look good with the makeover. I don't know. You know that She's All That movie? Is that what that's about? That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's
taking the glasses off the designer. Yeah, that's
You
it.
come down the stairs and the guy's like, "Oh my gosh, wow! I never realized when she took off her glasses how beautiful she was. I'm in love."
Design's been beautiful the whole time.
Glasses can make you not tell they're Superman. You can't tell that they're
magical. I'm gonna take off my glasses one day when I need to reinvent.
Me too.
Yeah, damn. I feel like you get an extra round, like an extra life, if you're playing strip poker compared to us.
True.
Glasses.
That is true.
You got one up on us.
I don't know that from experience, but it sounds like you do, Tom. So, okay.
Yeah, it does.
That's why he doesn't wear glasses. He wants to get straight down to the nitty gritty.
Why do you think he's wearing a hoodie inside his house?
Is that what we're doing here? I didn't sign up for it.
Yeah, we're pivoting the show, Andy. We forgot to tell you. So I would love to get in a nutshell version of where you got to where you got, because I think most people are familiar with at least one of your projects, but you've had a hell of a career. You've got so much going on. I'm going to give you a challenge because it's quite a story. Do you think you could do it in 2 minutes?
No, but I will give it a shot. I
love that honesty. Yeah,
I'm not great in a nutshell. My wife kids that she needs to just be on my show, and just from time to time she'll look at me and say, "In a nutshell." And I was like, I don't know how to do that.
Okay, well, in that case, let's get the shell of this nut and let's smash it to pieces, and you just do your thing, man.
All right, I feel better now. But I'll try to give you the nutshell version. I started out my career in the heyday of blogs. Things were happening. They were ravenous for content, like 6 posts a day. Whatever you threw at them, they had to put it up because they were just desperate for fresh content. And I graduated college off the back of that, got a few jobs off the back of that. And I was so hyped up with the momentum after school that I did all this crazy stuff. Like we bought a house, I got married, I had a kid, I quit my job, went full-time freelance, moved from the UK to the US, spent all of our money like in a very short period of time. And then the economy tanks, blogs virtually disappear, at least the ones that I was working with.
Mm-hmm. And you're talking like 2008 at this point, right?
Yeah.
Where the economy tanked.
Yeah, 2008.
We remember the dark years well.
And all of this momentum and everything that I'd kind of put my hopes on just disappeared almost overnight. And for like 6 months, I didn't get any jobs. And I was I tried everything I knew how to do. And the only thing I really knew how to do was email blogs. That wasn't working anymore. And so at this, I spent a lot of time. I actually tanked so hard that I did the unthinkable. I'm actually kind of worried about saying this in front of you in case one of you passes out, but
porn?
No. That would have been way crazier. It's crazier than that, actually. I took down my website.
Wow. Why?
I quit. Because I would just quit. I bet so much on it. I'd kind of tasted some dream opportunities and I was just broken. It was like, when you get your heart broken and you feel like you're never going to love again. I was like, I'm breaking up with illustration and design. And I went and got a job at a juvenile detention center.
I did not know that. That's crazy.
Yeah, I did. It's true. I worked there for like 9 months. And turns out I sucked at that too. So, so I started. So I was like at rock bottom.
Well, when you suck at juvenile detention, does that mean that you suck because you're too mean or you're too nice?
I'm too nice. So it's the people that worked there were actually fantastic. They were just like 3 times larger than me and had like not a bleeding emo heart like I did. And so I would just like come home from those shifts and literally lay down on my living room floor and like cry until I fell asleep.
Oh no!
No,
I can't picture this at all. It's like, remember, no stabbing. Get out. Get on with it, you little scam.
True. I was a mess. I was a complete
pens, not knives.
Yeah, dude. I was a mess. The funny thing is that the reason I wanted to be an illustrator was because I wanted to avoid traditional employment because I'd had like part-time jobs and I would go work at this movie theater and they'd put you in that little ticket booth and I felt like I was in jail. And so I did everything. How do I avoid traditional employment at all costs to ending up in traditional employment working in a jail? It was like all this full circle, like facing my fears. It was horrifying. And so at that rock bottom, a lot of people turned to meth. I turned to darker stuff, marketing podcasts and like business books. That was my rock bottom. And I thought, man, I'm like a total sellout. But I started like diving into that world and I recognized that lots of the people that were the most celebrated in business were actually creative types. Maybe they didn't know that. The business people just thought they were just unicorns. Like they weren't really communicating that. I just kept like, as I was engrossed in this kind of content, I kept recognizing myself. I kept being like, that's what I'm like, but they're like crushing it in business. So I just kind of obsessively went down that rabbit hole. Learned a lot about marketing. Took me a long time to kind of translate what I learned from that world into the creative world, but I started making connections. Like, for instance, I realized that what creative people were calling side projects was virtually the same thing as content marketing. Yep. And we were calling collaborations what was essentially influencer marketing. And I just started like, I like to call it, instead of shooting for the lottery, trying to earn a paycheck. So just like, how do I get so good that I can show up and deliver value and I'll be undeniably good so I can build my kind of creative house on that instead of on the crumbling sands of the blogs.
And Andy, when you talk about being in this dark place of learning all this stuff, were you doing this for clients, like the podcast marketing and so on, or was it just all trying to build your personal brand?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll try to explain that. So when I was in that dark time, I started I was consuming a bunch of marketing podcasts. I was consuming this, and I was like early train of, not to be like, I was into podcasts before they were cool, but I was like early podcasts. I was like really obsessed with them. I started reading business books and business magazines.
One of your favorite podcasts that you listened to back then that was impactful for you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel a little bit weird about it, but I think it was called 48 Days to the Work You Love, something like that. I don't actually know that much about that one now because I kind of hopped off of that pretty quick, but my cousin Jeremy told me about it. That's how I got into that world. And then he ended up doing like stuff with Michael Hyatt and a whole bunch, all like the Nashville business scene. And I started consuming all that. And then I started reading like the little books that Harvard was putting out on business. And then I kind of just branched out from there. But all this stuff that I was consuming, I started using everything I was learning and putting it into my illustration. So I wasn't doing any teaching. This is like 2010. I didn't get a podcast until 2014, in a time where my career had completely turned around and I had I'd kind of built a pretty good illustration practice by that time. So I had used all. Go ahead.
How did you go from the fact that you were in this really dark hole and picking up momentum enough to sort of start looking at marketing? What was your mindset? I mean, that's quite a jump. Like, how did you get to that point?
Desperation.
Okay, desperation. Yeah.
Yeah, because
it's a good motivator.
Yeah, it is. And what happened was, I got that job at the juvenile detention center. It was actually a youth shelter attached to a juvenile detention center.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that if I worked at one, I had to work at both. And I actually I had auditioned. I had interviewed. What the heck is that? Delusions of grandeur. I interviewed actually for another job in social care. Like, I was pretty dedicated to changing my career, and it just destroyed me to the level. Like, I couldn't. I'm a very soft human. Like, I can't. I have to be careful what kind of stuff I consume or whatever, because I'm very empathetic to a kind of extreme degree. Yeah. And so I would literally just come home from that. I can't work in social work. It just, I would be, I wouldn't stay around.
Kill you.
Yeah, it'd kill me.
Yeah.
And so I had really shifted. I'd even, like I said, interviewed for this other job that was it was like a social worker. But it was just destroying me to the point of, and the other thing I think that was happening was, the first time I'd attempted a creative career, I think I always say it was like Super Mario Brothers 3 with the warp whistle. Like, I had tried to figure out all these ways to avoid actually going through the journey. Like, how do I, you know what I mean? And I think that was just a lack of belief in myself. I just thought, I need to skip to the end. I need to skip to the great clients. What's the trick? What's the hack? How do I get around actually finding my style and actually creating a proper business and learn, all of that.
Who thought like that.
Right.
I think that's a lot of people now.
Yeah.
But that's what was going on. And so I think when I was at that rock bottom, I think I got to a place where I was like, one thing that happened, which I think really helps explain what was going on, I was at this rock bottom, and I think I started getting desperate about, is there any way out of here? And I remembered this email that I'd got from a guy in Cincinnati who was running a gallery a long time before. And I thought, it's just a random thing, but maybe I'll try that. I'll email him back because I think he wanted to do a show. And so I emailed him back. We ended up hitting it off and did this collaborative exhibit. I went to Cincinnati and I was in his gallery, and this guy, I'll tell you a little bit about it. So I had done this indie rock coloring book. He wanted to take this adult coloring thing, which wasn't really a thing. Like, that was an idea all on its own, like an adult coloring in 2009. And he wanted to take that idea and bring it to his gallery space and have us do this giant black and white mural that would be like a giant coloring sheet for the audience to come in on the opening night and color. And so I reconnected with him. I decided to give it a shot. We did it collaboratively. The day before I got there, he called me and he's like, he's like a conceptual guy. And he's like, I think the concept's just not working because you have this giant coloring sheet wall, but people are going to be coloring it in with like regular sized markers. That doesn't make any sense. They should be coloring it in with giant 5-foot markers. And I was like, yeah, if you know a guy who knows magic, I'm down with it. I'm not, against sorcery of that nature. And I, got off the phone knowing I would go there tomorrow and there's not going to be giant markers. He's going to figure out that that's impossible and we'll just do it the regular way. And I drove to Cincinnati and I got into the gallery. It's this gorgeous gallery and there they are, giant 5-foot markers.
That's awesome.
And I was like,
I feel like
what the heck is
this is every creative's dream. I felt like
it was amazing. I was like, what, how, where? And he just acted like it was nothing. He's like, yeah, I made those last night. And I was like, huh? What? And actually everything in the gallery was like that. It was like literally, stepping into like Alice stepping into Wonderland of like, this is a whole magical, like he had done giant Connect 4 and like a I don't know, 8-foot, 10-foot Connect 4. And he had built this huge gallery. It was gorgeous, amazing furniture, all these incredible zines. Like he had this zine that he made where it was actually a screen printed cereal box and inside were bran flakes. And inside the sealed bag of bran flakes was the zine as the prize of the cereal box. And I was just like, Yeah, I actually have it over there. And I was just like blown away. And then, and by the way, his name's Andrew Nyer. And people, we did the show, and everybody that would pick up those giant markers would just have this giant smile on their face. They'd just be like his work was so clearly a gift. And it was so clear that he was gifted. And he embodied somebody who went through the maze, went through the journey, he'd found his style, he'd put in the time, he didn't try to hack his way around it. And I think I saw myself in him. And in that, I thought, I can do this. Like I can go through the hard stuff. And I think like my growth mindset was kind of birthed in that time. And I always joke that I don't think I would have picked up on these clues. I don't think I would have saw myself in him had it not been for the huge hint from the universe. I don't know if you know this, but so his name's Andrew Nyer. Andrew is like the mature professional version of the name Andy.
Yeah.
That's my name. And so I remember like going home so like I had my hope again, and I called my wife on the highway, and I was like, I know like the bills are stacking up and empty cupboards and all that crap, but I can't explain it, but I feel like everything's going to be okay. I met my future me.
Wow.
He's very professional. It's going to be fine. And I was so excited that I drove an hour past my exit before I realized it.
Wow.
So that he really inspired me to like, okay, I can go put in the time and learn the business, learn the creativity. That sparked like some personal creative projects of just putting in the time, and then also digging deeper into the business books and trying to figure that out.
I love it. So I'm gonna do what Ian normally does. Ian's a huge fan for the nuts and bolts. And I think
it's just because my mind's so simple, it needs the nuts and bolts.
Hey, I mean, I love a good tactic, a lot of practical. Yeah,
I think you need both, right? And we always try and tackle that on the show. Like the mindset is so crucial, but equally, I don't want people to be like, "Yeah, I feel really pumped up," but now what?
How do I do?
I do.
Yeah,
I agree completely.
I know you touched on before we started recording how you've had quite a breadth of work, and you've been able to tap into these different industries. So you've had like kids illustrations and advertising, editorial, and so on. I know a lot of junior people in all of those spaces, and they're in that early phase where it's like you're just trying to hold on and have some faith it's all going to work out. You're trying to grind it out, but you're barely getting any clients. You're putting yourself out there, and it's trying to say to these people like, keep going and keep at it. What for you tactically worked? What gave you the feet in the door? What got things off the ground for you in those phases?
Yeah. So, I have plenty to say on that. I started doing this personal project. It wasn't anything crazy. It was a new character every weekday for a year. That got the attention of this client that will not be named because they were the most god-awful client on the planet.
Yeah. And Andy, you say it got the attention. What, you were releasing it on social media?
On Tumblr. Yeah.
On Tumblr. And they just stumbled across it and then got in touch.
They tumbled across it. I'm sorry. Anyway, they found it. I was, I'd done like 100 days into this project, Tumblr featured it. And so, before that I was getting like 1 like, 2 like, 0 likes. And then eventually that one got like 5,000 likes in a very short period of time. I started getting a few extra clients, and one of these clients, which I have a million stories about this, but I won't go there. They started working with me. I really didn't want to work with them because they were god awful, but I didn't have a choice. I had no idea how else to make money. So I was just working with them, which I'm really glad. Well, it was incredibly hard. And one quote that I always quote is from my dad. And he says, life is hard, but that doesn't mean it's bad. Hard and bad are not the same thing. Yeah. And so I'm so glad that I put in the time with this client, even though it was a rough experience, because it was one of the most game-changing experiences for me. They were a branded content company. And so what happened was I was doing these personal projects that were like slow build kind of stuff, but we would do a personal project with them. It was content marketing for a brand. And the next day it would be featured on the front page of BuzzFeed. And they were like doing it systematically. They were like, they weren't just successful, they knew how they were doing it. And so they were putting out all this content about this is what good brand content looks like. This is what it doesn't look like. These are all the strategies.
And I'd imagine that was very exciting to you because your talent wouldn't be able to get that many eyeballs alone.
Yes.
So suddenly your talent got amplified to a wider audience.
Which is true, but I was more interested. I was cool, but I was more interested in how are they doing that? How are they? What is it about the content I'm making that's so different to what they're making? And I started to read all their material, and then I skipped from that material to other marketing material about content marketing. And I learned all these like things that you could bake, strategies you could bake into your projects to maximize their strategic potential. One of the things that I came out with on the other side of that is your personal projects or your content marketing needs to, as closely as possible, mirror what you want to be hired for. It needs to be, or what you want your customers to buy from you. You know, if you're selling athletic products, there's no reason for you to be, writing blog posts on, I don't know, Zelda, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. It might get attention, but it's not going to convert to sales, right? And so I was doing these projects and I hadn't put any layers of strategy into it. And I was getting hired for really random things that I didn't want to do until I realized I need to write the script of the movie that I want to star in, right? I always think about it like does that make sense?
Yeah, completely.
Totally.
And it's surprisingly common advice on this show, whether it's content marketing or what goes in your portfolio, put out what you want to get back.
Yeah, absolutely. I always think about it through the lens of Good Will Hunting with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. They both wrote that. And actually, even though Matt was the star, they thought Ben had the better role because it was like a character acting thing with big monologues and all this stuff. But what they didn't know was people are going to typecast you as that for the rest of time. So if you go look at Matt Damon, all of his roles are the same thing, the unexpected thing. Like, oh, he's a janitor, but he's also a genius. Like, oh, he seems like a regular guy, but he's actually a serial killer. Oh, he seems like a regular guy, but he's actually a martial artist. Like literally the same plot over and over from Good Will Hunting.
That's a good point.
The same,
for the record,
same goes for Ben Affleck.
I freaking love that film, by the way.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah.
But Ben Affleck got typecast as pretty boy, towny idiot. And he had to write himself out of that. He had to write and direct himself out of that typecast. And so
true.
You have to be very careful about the types of projects you're doing. And, nowadays what I would tell people to do, like I've worked with a guy, he wanted to work for Patagonia making their catalogs. And I was like, what you should do is make an outdoor zine, make it very similar in the ways that they do good stuff with their catalog, but ultimately show them what they should be doing better. How could you elevate it? How could you make your thing better than what they're doing? Because that's the only reason they would need you. But go take their specifications. I have this process of write your dream brief from your dream client and then just figure out how to make it yourself for your own customers. And if you do that well enough, you will somehow get into at least the back door of that market.
Okay, I want to pause there because I think that's better worded than that's ever been on this show. Like you're
we normally fumble to that.
Yeah. We skirt around that, but write a brief, your dream brief from your dream client, and make that. I freaking love that. That's
me too.
That's so awesome. Something I see quite often is the difference between like inbound marketing and outbound, where inbound is more content and brand building and clients coming to you. Outbound is more pitching and so
reaching out.
So do you believe in both? Because I think a lot of people, are taking that advice, and it's definitely good advice, and they have a portfolio that's very set up to attract the right kind of client. But if no one's seeing it and their social media hasn't really taken off yet, they're not going to get a lot of work. So were you doing a lot of pitching, networking? Like, how are you getting in front of people?
Yeah. I mean, I think of it like, I think about this a lot because although I'm really, really heavy on the content side and, putting in the time, making fantastic work that kind of scales naturally and organically, I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the thousands of emails that I've written, right?
Okay.
I'm really interested in, there's this comedian, and it's eluding me right now. We might have to look it up. I'll send it to you so you can put it in the show notes. But she had this notion where she was going to go out and get 100 rejections. That was her goal. So she for articles, she wanted to write articles for the New York Times and all these other companies. And she was really intimidated by it. And she decided that she was actually going to make the goal not to work for the New York Times, but to get as many rejections as humanly possible. And within like 25 emails, she had more stuff than she could do, and she couldn't finish the project. And so although I am a big believer in putting in the work and the power of content and the power of making share-worthy stuff that kind of has organic growth, I think on the other flip side of that, I do think a ton about influencer marketing. I didn't probably call it that back in the day, but that's probably the lion's share of my effort on, reaching out and pitching and all that kind of stuff doesn't even go to the hands of clients. It usually goes into collaborative efforts with peers.
Okay. So just to go deeper on that, you mentioned thousands of emails. So you're not emailing thousands of dream clients, you're emailing thousands of more established, more well-known illustrators. You're doing collaborative pieces with them to get in front of their wider audiences and therefore get the client inquiries via them. Is that what you're saying?
And so I don't have tremendous success in pitching myself directly to businesses. I think that I've tried to, reverse engineer how does someone, I think we're not unlike bands, you know what I mean? Like, for the most part, at least illustrators, maybe not always so much with designers. I could see how there's some differences here, but your favorite designer, your favorite band, your favorite illustrator, how did you discover that? Like, I think that we're getting to the point where it used to be we trusted a publication. It used to be that we trusted a friend, but like most of the time we want the feeling of discovering something by ourselves. We want it to feel like we discovered it. I imagine how many times how many of your favorite bands were the ones that stopped you in the middle of the street and forced headphones on you and were like, listen to this. And you're like, whoa, that's the worst way to encounter art.
Yeah.
And I think that, knowing that in terms of just the 80-20 rule, like what you're going to spend your time doing, I've just, for the most part, avoided contacting clients directly that I wanted to work with. Now, I'm going to flip that on its head just slightly though, because this is one of my favorite tactics. And it's something I did, but then I heard it articulated more succinctly by Shane Snow. He wrote a book called Smart Cuts. Anyway, I'm just referencing him because he helped me build what I suggest people do, which is, don't go straight to Ganon. I don't know if you've played the new Zelda game, but it's open world. You can go almost from the start of the game, you can go straight to the final boss, right? Now, obviously, if you do that, you're going to get your ass handed to you, right? Because you're like in old-timey underwear and you only have a stick. Like, you're not even going to get in the castle. And so the same goes for like, if you're an illustrator and you want to work with the New York Times, just emailing the New York Times is not that great of a strategy. Like, they have this, I asked Seth Godin this when he was on my podcast. I said, what would you tell somebody an illustrator that wants to work with the New York Times? And his answer was, pick a different line. Like, not only is that line huge, but there are lines that are better for you, that are just lesser known. And so what I did starting out, and I did this intuitively without the work of Shane Snow. He just helped me explain it. Early on, I really wanted to do gig posters, but it was after that scene had already blown up. So like that castle was super high and there were crazy gatekeepers and I could not find a way in. And so what I ended up doing was listing out all of my favorite bands and then just finding which of my, and all of them had to be like critically acclaimed in terms of like they're legit bands with diehard fans. But I went through that list and I tried to find a backdoor into the castle by saying, okay, some of the most critically acclaimed on this list are the least known. So within the castle, they're like the kings, but outside the castle, nobody even knows who they are. And so I went through that list and I found, especially at the time, Kurt Weill had just kind of started to do his thing. And so on his website, his email address was on there. And so I found these like personal ways in, and I emailed a handful of bands and they became my first gig posters, which gives you the credibility. Once you're in the castle, which is the hardest thing to do, it's so much easier to, land one of your favorite bands or, work with the New York Times or what have you. Is that
was the first time you did a poster for your bands? Did you do it as a paid job?
Yeah, it was a paid job, but it wasn't good pay. I mean, there's not very much good money in music regardless, but I think it was some kind of like split of like, you can do my posters. I'll give you 50 to sell in your shop and you give me 50 to sell on my merch table. And there's no,
okay. Because sometimes like people are like, you approach them and they're like, well, we haven't really got the budget or anything like that. We're in small bands, but giving them like saying, okay, we'll get these printed. I'll give you half of them. You sell them at your band. I'll sell them elsewhere is a good, I think people see it as like a one avenue in terms of like, can I do this for you? And they're like, no. But if you give them like, if you give an example of how you can work for them,
if you actually give them
scenario,
an out.
Yes. I completely agree. And actually, I also think that there's kind of a false dichotomy or a kind of binary way of thinking about whether it's work for exposure for free or whether it's paid. And I'm not saying, I always tell people you should work for free, but just do it for yourself. And because there's a bunch of gray in between there. So like, the example with the band is a gray area, but also how do you make things collaborations instead of just contractual kind of thing. So like, that's something I think about all the time as when you're having a collaboration, you want it to be, I always use this example, which is ridiculous, but this idea of like, if you're going to collaborate with somebody, you're making a creative baby. Okay. And you got to make sure that what that person wants and is trying to get from this collaboration is the same thing you want. You can't be in on this creative collaboration for a one night stand if they're trying to get pregnant. Like, it's just unfair. Like, and the best ones for me are the ones where you not just, this is getting so ridiculous. When I'm saying this on my podcast and it's just me, it's less awkward. But, cause then I don't have to ever see anybody look at me saying it.
Yeah.
But this idea that, the best collaborations for me are ones where two become one and become three. You have a creative baby that has its own life of its own. And that's one of the things I did a lot was like doing collaborations with friends or businesses where we came together and made something of its own volition. So like that show I did with Andrew, it became this thing called Color Me. We've been doing it for like almost 10 years and it's developed its own style that I only do that style when I'm working with him. So it's its own creative entity and we both get different types of value from it. We're very open about what those values are and what the exchange is and what have you. I don't know if I'm making any sense anymore. I've somehow dropped down into health class with birds and the bees, but there you go.
I love going deep on this stuff. I guess my final question on this front, are you doing the classic when you approach the band and the clients and the potential collaborators, is it the classic email of just like, hey man, love your stuff, I'd love to work for you, I'd love to work with you, just that simple? Or is there some magic happening that we're not aware of?
I that's pretty much all I do. I will say I had an episode of my show where I had my buddy Kyle Schiele come on because he's kind of the master of this cold call email thing. He's just happened to be like, he's made friends with like so many weird famous people and wormed his way in. Like he's one of my best friends. The only reason I know him is because he paid for a coaching call with me and then somehow made me his best friend. That's just his nature. So I did an episode called something about how, sending emails that'll change your life. And he has a section of that and he has all kinds of little things. Like one thing he'll do, he's a public speaker full time and the only way he gets those gigs are cold call emails. So he's learned all kinds of little things. Like one thing is, people really like to check things off. Like accomplish a task. So if you send an email and you send them a giant paragraph, that's a really hard thing to check off. Whereas if you send them an email and say, hey, are you already done booking your speakers for the conference? They can reply like that and say no or yes. And then all of a sudden, now that they've answered you and let down that wall, you're in the castle. Now you have a dialogue. Now you have a relationship. And so I've, over time, I've gotten better at like learning some of that. But the band stuff was, pretty traditional, like probably too much of a super fan. But yeah, like
I love that.
Can I flip direction a little bit? Your work is so playful, and I don't know, it just makes me feel good. It truly does, Andy.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Forget all this stuff about like making money or getting clients and all that kind of stuff. Like when you actually sit down and you're just doing things without thinking I have to draw like Andy J Pizza or I have to do this for this thing. Like, can you kind of paint a picture of what an enjoyable creative time is for you? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think you're kind of asking about how do I get into my creative flow state? Like when it's nothing about money, when it's just about the love of creativity. I put a ton of time and energy into thinking about this recently because I like to draw a lot. Like I like it a lot, but I rarely get into the flow state while I'm drawing. Like I almost exclusively get into the flow state while I'm thinking. And then I've realized I do it even more so when I'm writing. So most of the time, the other thing is I'm very averse to boredom. So that's why I think I've become such an obsessive thinker. I don't know if I'm a smart thinker, but I do know how to think, and I do some thinking, and it's become a thing of curing boredom, like losing track of myself in my head. So I'm always working, like for the past 3 days, if I'm in a situation where I'm a little bit bored or bummed out, I remember, oh yeah, I'm working on the title of my next book. Mm-hmm. And I'll just start kind of losing myself in trying to figure out some kind of concept that gets me pumped about that. Or, oh yeah, I haven't decided on next week's episode and I kind of know the vague idea, but I haven't found that clincher of a punchline that makes it have the special sauce that I'm looking for. So that's kind of where my best creative energy comes from. And that also manifests in telling stories on stage and also doing comics on Instagram. So that side is kind of, it's more writing than anything else.
So that's writing. So like when if you're thinking, oh, I'm trying to I love trying to find the idea for a name of a book. That would mean, okay, let's open up a word processor and let's start just writing stuff. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So sometimes that means that. Sometimes it's just literally thinking, like going on a jog and just thinking about it, whatever. But I have become more and more of an actual writer. Although it's still a weird process. I don't know if this is ADHD or not, but I love being immersed in water. I can stand in the ocean for like 4 hours at a time.
Me too. Do you do the thing where you just swim underwater for ages? Because that's my favorite part.
Like that too. Yeah, man. I love it. I love being like engulfed in the waves, but I also just take tons of baths, which is weird. But I do almost every morning.
You're and Ricky Gervais, not together.
Yeah. He does that?
Yeah. He has like 2 baths a day.
Yeah, I'm kind of like that. So I think it's like a sensory deprivation thing of like a focus. So I write on my phone in the bath most mornings. And I love writing is, the most flow state thing that I do. So I'll start. And the thing that I've learned and I'm trying to get better and better at is not writing and editing at the same time. So any tangent that hits me, I just try to explore it for fun. And that's where a weird idea will come up or a way of thinking about or an analogy or whatever. And the thing is that weirdly, like my educational side and my creative side have kind of merged. So the podcast to me, I'm always thinking about it through the lens of storytelling. I'm always using that structure. When I go do a talk on stage, it's rarely like, here's the 5 things I learned. And it's really like the talk that I've been doing that I'm kind of doing a tour of is really modeled after the hero's journey, of like plugging, and which is story structure. And so I do all that, and I just kind of look for patterns. That's all I do. That's literally all I do. in creativity is look for patterns.
I have to ask you, because you talked about self-editing. Have you ever heard of I've talked about this before, but have you ever heard of the world's most dangerous writing app?
No.
You should look it up on Google. It's really cool. It's called the world's most dangerous writing app. And essentially you go to the page, and once you start writing, you put it for 5 or 10 minutes. If you stop writing, it deletes everything that you wrote. So it forces you not to edit.
That's crazy.
I bet you would love
my gosh. Dude, that's awesome. That's exactly right. And actually, I think I've been exploring this idea a lot recently of, traditional productivity is kind of at odds with genuine creativity, which is a difficult thing about building a creative business, especially on the back of quality creative work, is that you have to go into blocks of time prepared to waste a lot of time to really get into that place of creativity. And I don't think that's toxic, creative mythology around, don't ask me to be productive. I don't know how to turn the magic on. The magic is having fun. And having fun on a timer is one of the weirdest ways to have time. Like, all right, fun, go. We've got 30 minutes. Like,
it's so true.
There's good things about constraints, and it's not binary, but to me, that's one of the things I've had to fight is when I'm writing, just write, and you might not use any of it. And, like maybe the one little thing came from that, and now that's the episode. But yeah, I have noticed it's for me. Everything's pattern recognition, conceptual illustrations like that. That's just, my takeaway from all that is it took me probably 10 years to find what my thing is. Like, what does my brain do that's different to other people? And I find patterns in soft information. So whether it's my story or I see a pattern from the business world that applies to the creative world, or I see, analogies are patterns. It's like, this thing's just like that thing.
So you're not so much of a data geek or that kind of pattern. It's more.
I still do that.
Yeah.
I still, I do. I don't think it expresses that as much because I'm so much more right-brained in the real version of right-brain, not like whatever. But I'm not. But I still do it. Like one of my favorite things is. But it's still, there's a soft element to it. Because one of the things I really doubled down on Instagram last year and, over doubled my numbers from, looking at the insights, going through and saying, I looked at what are my top engaged posts and what do they have in common? And start just start connecting those random dots like that. To me, that's my biggest creative output is that kind of. The same goes for, my heroes, like in my market of like, what are all these people? I would like one of my biggest breakthroughs creative style wise was creating this huge Pinterest board of like 200 illustrations and just going in and connecting dots of like, they're all using this color or this is all this kind of, there's,
And was it auditing? What do I like about these? What are the common threads? And
It's what's the pattern of why does this, just getting into my visceral kind of creative taste buds and saying, what are the things that are lighting me up on a visceral level and what are the things they have in common? And that starts to be my kind of creative true north. So that's again pattern recognition.
You know what I find weird about that phase? I don't know if you had the same experience because I did exactly the same thing when I was kind of figuring out my style. It's kind of half exciting because it's like new ground that you forging essentially. And then the other half is frustration because you're not quite there yet. So you're you're kind of like beating yourself up, but you're having fun doing it. I don't know. It's just it was a weird time for me. I don't know if you had the same thing.
Yeah, I did have the same thing. And actually, one of the things I think that's changed for me that I wish I could go back to my past self and say is, the reason why it was so gut-wrenching the first time is because I didn't believe in myself. Because I didn't think I could bridge that gap, or I wasn't sure that I could, right? So, but what I wish I would say, and now I'm a lot more comfortable trying new things because I'm, more confident in my abilities. I realize that pattern recognition thing, it's a creative tool. I can apply it to almost any type of creativity. And the thing I've realized is when I'm feeling that gut wrenching thing, instead of being like, oh, am I going to make it? I think, remember that feeling, it's called stakes. That means there are stakes to what you're doing. That's the only reason it's not boring. Enjoy it. Like, that's what I wish I could go back 5 years ago and be like, you know how you're, or 10 years ago, you know how you're such a ball of anxiety because you're like, I don't know if I can bridge this gap. We're like, that feeling of being nervous, that's why this is fun at all. Mm-hmm. If there was no challenge, it would be boring, just like your job at the movie theater. Like that's what makes this fun. And you are really capable. Like you, there's so much you can grow and adapt to. And that's just, growth mindset stuff that you learn over time.
I heard this thing that anxiety and excitement are actually the same exact physiological things, except for we just put a different label on it.
Yep.
That's amazing. And that's one of my biggest shifts is now, like once I have, some confidence and I realize like it's only fun to play at games where you're not sure you're going to win. I think I've kind of shifted that. Like, there's a really good Twilight Zone, which I didn't see. I heard someone describe it on a podcast. But it's about like this guy who dies and goes to the afterlife, and the guy's there and he's like, you can have anything you want. You see that giant house? It's yours if you want it. And let's go, go play card games. And he's like winning every card game. He's like, this is kind of not that fun to win every time. And the guy's like, well, how many times do you want to lose? And he's like, no, that's not the point. He's like, man, I didn't think heaven would be like this. And he's like, who said you're in heaven? But that's right. That, we need those stakes. Like that's what keeps the game interesting. And
what movie is that?
Yeah. It's a Twilight Zone episode, but
so good.
I didn't actually see it firsthand. I heard it described on, I think, Pete Holmes' podcast.
I've got really into The Good Place lately. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, it's awesome.
I love that. I love anything like that.
Yeah.
Like that otherworldly. Yeah, I love thinking about the afterlife, and I'm a sucker for that. But it's a great show.
Don't get this group started on philosophy. Yeah. Justin's going to unload his whole library.
Yeah.
We love some philosophizing. Hey guys, so because it ended up being a long and very awesome chat with Andy, what we've done is we've split this episode into 2 parts. Be sure to tune in next week for the second part of this discussion because it is seriously good and Andy drops a ton of value. So we hope you enjoyed part 1 and we'll see you next week. As always, you can find full show notes over at honestdesigners.com or find us over on iTunes and now Spotify by searching for The Honest Designers Show. And remember, we're now on social media too, if you search for Honest Designers. If today's episode helped you, then it would mean the world to us if you took just a moment to leave us a quick review over on iTunes, as this is one of the best ways for other designers to discover the show. Thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you next week right here on The Honest Designers Show.